The smoke rose every morning, thin, gray, barely more than a whisper against the iron sky of a Dakota winter. It curled up from the frozen hillside southeast of Millhaven, like the breath of something buried alive rising from nowhere, rising from nothing, drifting apart before anyone could follow it back to its source. People noticed it in November. They talked about it in December. By January, it had become the kind of mystery that a small town chews on during the long dark months when there is nothing else to do but survive and speculate. Where was it coming from? There was no cabin on that hillside, no dugout anyone could see, no structure of any kind, just frozen grass and snow-crusted earth and that thin thread of smoke rising every single morning like a signal from another world. Mayor Silas Drummond had searched that hillside 3 times with parties of men. He had walked every foot of frozen ground, looked behind every rock, peered into every natural fold of the earth. He had found nothing, nothing but dead grass and cold silence and that faint smell of wood smoke that seemed to come from the ground itself. He told people what he believed. He said the girl was dead, frozen somewhere out on the prairie, her body buried under a drift that wouldn't give her up until spring. The smoke, he said, was probably some natural phenomenon. Gas escaping from the earth. It meant nothing. She meant nothing. The matter was closed. But Silas Drummond was wrong about all of it. 15 feet below his boots on that third search, Astrid Voss lay in her bed and listened to him walk across her roof. She was 17 years old. She was warm. She was breathing. She was alive in a way that the people of Millhaven, South Dakota, had decided she had no right to be. And she was waiting. To understand what Astrid built, you have to understand what she lost. And to understand what she lost, you have to understand who her father was. Erling Voss had come to Dakota Territory from the Telemark region of Norway in 1868, the year Astrid was born, though she would not be born for another 3 years back in the old country, where her mother still waited for the farm that Erling kept promising was almost ready. He was not a dishonest man. He was simply a man who believed in the future more than the present, who could see the homestead fully built in his mind long before the first post was driven into the ground. He brought his wife Ingrid and their infant daughter Astrid to Dakota in 1871. The crossing was brutal. Ingrid did not survive her second winter on the prairie. She died in February of 1872. Quietly, in the way that exhausted women sometimes die when the cold takes the last warmth they have been saving for someone else. Erling buried her on the edge of his claim and kept going. There was nothing else to do. He had a daughter who needed feeding, and a farm that needed building, and a Dakota winter that did not care about either. He raised Astrid the way a man raises a daughter, when there is no one else to help, completely desperately teaching her everything he knew and everything he learned, making her capable of every task on the homestead, because he understood, in the way that men who have already lost too much understand, that capability is the only inheritance that cannot be taken away. She could read and write in both English and Norwegian before she was 8. She could butcher a hog cure, a side of pork, and preserve enough vegetables to last a Dakota winter before she was 12. She knew the stars well enough to navigate by them, knew the weather well enough to read it 3 days ahead, knew the land well enough to find water where other men would see only dry grass. Erling gave her all of this, and then in his one great failure of judgment, he gave her Helga. Helga Thorvaldsen had come to Millhaven in the spring of 1882, a widow from Minnesota with a pleasant face and practical hands, and a manner so sensible and capable that half the women in town liked her immediately. Erling had been alone for 10 years. He was not a young man anymore, and the farm was getting harder, and Astrid was 13 and would need things that a father could not provide. He married Helga in June of 1882. Astrid stood at the ceremony in her one good dress and tried to feel something other than the particular loneliness of a child who has been replaced but cannot say so without seeming ungrateful. For 4 years the arrangement held. Helga ran the house efficiently. She was not cruel to Astrid, not openly. She was simply indifferent in the precise and calculated way of a woman who has already decided that her affection has limits and that a stepdaughter falls outside those limits. She spoke to Astrid when necessary. She acknowledged her existence when required. She did nothing more, Erling noticed. He was not blind, but he was tired in the way that men who work the land become tired, not just in the body, but in the will. And he told himself that things would improve, that Helga just needed time, that Astrid was strong and would be fine. He was right about Astrid. He was wrong about Helga. And in the autumn of 1886, when a horse spooked at a rattlesnake along the southern fence line, and Erling Voss went down hard and did not get up, the truth about Helga, Voss came out fast enough to take the breath away. Erling died on a Tuesday in September. They buried him on Thursday. By Saturday, the grief in the Voss household had barely begun to settle when Helga sat Astrid down at the kitchen table and produced a document that changed everything. It was a legal paper, properly signed, properly witnessed, bearing the seal of a Sioux Falls attorney. It established Helga's rights as widow and sole inheritor of the Voss homestead, all its buildings, all its livestock, all its equipment, all its land. Astrid looked at the paper. Then she looked at Helga. "When did you have this made?" she asked. Helga folded her hands on the table. "That is not your concern." But it was, because the signature on the witness line was dated 14 months earlier. 14 months, which meant that while Erling Voss was still alive, still working his land, still trusting his wife, Helga had already been to Sioux Falls, had already found an attorney, had already planned exactly what she would do when he was gone. She had not been waiting for him to die. She had been preparing for it. "This homestead belongs to me now," Helga said. "The law is clear. You are not my daughter. You are not my responsibility. You'll need to make other arrangements." Astrid sat very still for a moment. Outside, the September wind moved through the grass with a sound like breathing. Somewhere in the yard, one of the horses stamped and snorted. "My father's land," Astrid said. "My husband's land," Helga said, "which is now mine. He built it from nothing. He was here before there was a road or a town or a—" "I know what he did." Helga's voice did not rise. It never rose. That was the thing about Helga. Her cruelty was perfectly controlled, always delivered in the tone of simple, reasonable explanation, as though the facts were regrettable but unavoidable, and she personally bore no responsibility for any of them. "I also know what the law says. I suggest you speak to Mayor Drummond if you have questions. He was kind enough to review the document before your father's passing." Before your father's passing. Astrid heard those words and understood what they meant. Drummond had known. He had reviewed this document while Erling was still alive, had said nothing, had perhaps even offered his approval. And now he would enforce it because that was what men like Silas Drummond did. They protected the arrangements that kept them comfortable, and they called it law. She took nothing when she left. There was nothing she was permitted to take. The town of Millhaven watched Astrid Voss walk down its main street on a Saturday morning in September with the clothes on her back and nowhere to go. They watched from the windows of the mercantile, from the doorway of the post office, from the bench outside the barber shop, where three men sat in the early autumn sun, and observed her passing with the mild curiosity of people watching weather move through. Mayor Silas Drummond was standing in front of the land office when she passed. He was a large man, well-fed with a gray mustache, in the particular bearing of a man who has held local authority long enough to confuse his own preferences with the public good. He watched Astrid walk, and he said what he said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That's what happens when a girl doesn't make herself useful. A decent young woman would find a way to be valuable to her family. Instead, she wanders off like a vagrant and expects the town to feel sorry for her." The men on the bench nodded. A woman in the doorway of the millinery shop pulled her shawl tighter and looked away. No one said anything in Astrid's defense. No one offered her a meal or a room or even a word of ordinary human kindness. She kept walking. Her face was calm. Her hands were steady. Whatever she was feeling, and she was feeling everything all at once, grief and rage and terror, and a cold-focused anger that would not waste itself on tears, she kept it inside behind her eyes where it would be useful later. She walked until Millhaven was behind her, and the prairie opened up around her, vast and cold and indifferent, in the way that only the Dakota grasslands can be indifferent, a landscape so enormous that human suffering simply disappears into it without leaving a mark. She walked 5 miles north, to the only person in the territory who she believed might help her. Old Halvar Bjorn had homesteaded on Bottle Creek in 1854, which made him the oldest continuous resident of what would eventually become Millhaven County. He had been there before the town, before the railroad, before the land office and the mercantile and Mayor Silas Drummond, and everything else that had arrived in the last 30 years and arranged itself into the comfortable fiction of civilization. He was 71 years old and built like a post, not tall, but dense with hands so weathered they looked like they'd been carved from the same cottonwood he'd been splitting for 50 years. His face was a map of every winter he'd survived, which was many. His eyes were pale blue and extremely alert, the eyes of a man who had learned that inattention on the Dakota prairie is a form of suicide. He had known Erling Voss from the beginning, had helped him build his first sod house, had taught him things about reading weather and finding water and working with the land rather than against it. Had spent 30 years watching Erling's daughter grow from a bright-eyed infant into the most capable young woman Halvard had met in half a century of knowing capable people. When Astrid appeared at his door that September morning, Halvard looked at her for a long moment. He took in the clothes, the absence of any bag or bundle, the particular set of her jaw that said she was holding herself together by will alone. "Come in," he said. "There's coffee." She sat at his table and told him everything. She told it plainly, without embellishment, in the way her father had taught her to report important information, just the facts in order, without decoration. The document, the date on the witness signature, Drummond's involvement, the walk through town, what Drummond had said on the street. Halvard listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. He refilled her coffee. He looked out the window at the autumn sky, which was the color of pewter and moving fast from the northwest. "Your father came to see me," Halvard said finally, 3 months ago, before the accident." Astrid looked up. He was worried. Wouldn't say exactly why, but a man knows when another man is making arrangements. "He asked me some questions about the land north of his claim. That stretch of hills the county surveyor marked as unfit for cultivation. 30 acres of nothing but grass and glacial rock and a south-facing slope that nobody wanted." "I know the place," Astrid said. "Your father filed on it," Halvard said. "Quietly. Didn't tell Helga. Registered it in your name, not his. Said he had a feeling it might matter someday." He paused. "I think he knew more than he let on about what Helga was." Astrid was very still. "He left something with me," Halvard said. "For you. Said to give it to you if anything happened to him and you came here alone." He went to the shelf above his stove and took down a tin box that had once held tobacco. Inside was an envelope sealed with wax, with Astrid's name written on it in her father's careful hand. She opened it slowly. The letter inside was 2 pages written close. She read it at Halvard's table while the October wind, it was October now in her mind, though it was still September. It felt like October. It felt like the world had skipped ahead into winter without warning, pressed against the windows, and tested the joints of the old man's house. Erling Voss had written the letter in June, 4 months before his death. He had written it calmly, matter-of-factly, in the same voice he used for everything. He told Astrid that he was worried about Helga, and that he was sorry he had not seen her clearly sooner. He told her about the 30 acres. He told her they were hers legally and completely, and that the registration was filed in Sioux Falls where Helga's attorney would not think to look. He told her that the south-facing slope had potential that most people couldn't see because most people didn't know what to look for. And then he told her about the hillside. He had walked it carefully, measured it, thought about it, and he had written down in his precise engineer's hand exactly what he believed could be built there and how and why it would hold against anything the Dakota winter could deliver. He had learned it from Halvard, who had learned it from the Lakota. The earth stays the same temperature year, Erling had written. 55 degrees, give or take. Doesn't matter what happens above. The ground itself remembers summer. If you build into the south face of that hill the right way, it will keep you warmer than any cabin for a fraction of the fuel. Halvard knows the method. He'll teach you if you ask. "I hope you never need this, Astrid, but I believe in being ready. Your father." She read the letter twice, then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and looked at Halvard Bjorn across his kitchen table. "Will you teach me?" she said. The old man nodded slowly. "That's why he left it with me." They started in the first week of October. The ground was still workable, not soft, not the way it would be in spring, but not yet frozen solid the way it would be in another month. They had a narrow window, and Halvard was insistent about using every day of it. He could not dig himself. His hands were too arthritic, had been for years, the joints swollen and locked in the morning, so that he had to hold them under warm water for 20 minutes before they would close properly. But his mind was sharp as it had ever been, and he knew every detail of the technique with the precision of a man who had built one himself 40 years ago and who had been thinking about it ever since. He directed. Astrid dug. The work was brutal. She was 17 years old and strong from a lifetime of farm labor, but cutting into a hillside with hand tools in October in Dakota is the kind of work that strips a person down to what they actually are. Every morning she woke before dawn. Every evening she stopped only when she could no longer see. Every day the hole got a little deeper, a little wider, a little more like what Halvard described. He came out to supervise whenever he could manage the walk. 5 miles was hard for him now, and he couldn't always make it, but he came 3 or 4 times a week and stood at the edge of the excavation and watched her work and offered corrections in his slow, precise way. The entrance had to face south. This was not negotiable. The winter sun low on the horizon would warm the threshold and help prevent icing. The entrance corridor had to angle down slightly, just 2 or 3 degrees, so that cold air, which was heavy, would pool at the bottom of the slope and not flow into the main room. The chimney had to be positioned exactly narrow enough that it looked like nothing from above, but angled correctly to draw efficiently without backflowing smoke into the living space. He taught her how to cut sod blocks that would hold their shape, how to stack them so they locked together without mortar, how to pack the joints with dry grass and clay that would harden to near concrete in the frost. He taught her how to roof the excavation with a framework of cottonwood poles covered with sod layered, so that the whole thing looked from above like an unremarkable fold in the hillside. He taught her about the chimney. This was the part he was most precise about because the chimney was the only thing that could give her away. He showed her how to run the pipe from the stove up through the roof at an angle so that it emerged not at the obvious apex of the structure, but at a spot 15 feet away, tucked between two rocks that had been there since the glaciers retreated. Anyone searching from above would see the pipe as a dead stick wedged in a rock pile. The smoke, by the time it reached the surface, was thin enough and cold enough that it dispersed quickly. In winter morning air, it looked like nothing, like breath, like the earth exhaling, like smoke from nowhere. Word reached Millhaven within 2 weeks. It always did. The Dakota Prairie was vast, but the human networks that crossed it were tight and quick, and someone always saw something, and what they saw always made its way back to town. The Voss girl was digging into a hillside out on the North County land, people said, living like a badger, building herself a hole in the ground like an animal. Mayor Silas Drummond was not amused. He led the first search party in late October. A dozen men on horseback riding out on a gray morning with their breath fogging in the cold and their confidence high. They knew what they were looking for, a hole in a hillside. How hard could it be? They searched for 2 hours. They found nothing. The entrance to the dugout was hidden behind a fold in the hill that was only visible if you approached from exactly the right angle, which was an angle that made no instinctive sense to someone unfamiliar with the terrain. The chimney pipe from a distance was indistinguishable from the dead sticks and glacial rubble scattered across the hilltop. The sod roof had already begun to blend with the surrounding ground, the cut edges softening in the frost into the same texture as undisturbed earth. They walked right over it. Drummond himself walked directly across the roof of the main room, his horse's hooves striking the packed earth above Astrid's ceiling close enough that she could feel the vibration through the ground beneath her feet. She stood in the darkness of her half-finished home and listened to them search. She could hear their voices, muffled but distinct, carrying the particular irritation of men who are not finding what they came to find. She heard Drummond's voice above the others, insisting they look again, certain that there had to be something they were missing. There was. They just weren't capable of finding it. After 2 hours, they rode back to Millhaven. Drummond told people the girl had probably moved on, probably gone to another county. The smoke, he said again, was a natural phenomenon, not worth worrying about. But it kept rising, every morning, thin and gray and impossibly persistent. He sent a second party in November. They did better. One man actually found the rock pile that concealed the chimney pipe, crouched down to examine it, and then stood up and walked away because what he saw looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. A pile of rocks with a dead stick in it, nothing more. Drummond sent a third party in December this time, including himself and 2 men who had spent years as scouts and trackers and claimed they could find anything on the open prairie. They spent 4 hours on that hillside. They found a rabbit warren, an old fire pit that predated the territory, and a deposit of glacial till that one of the trackers thought might be worth investigating for minerals. They did not find Astrid Voss. Drummond stood on the hilltop at the end of the fourth hour, his boots planted directly above the room where Astrid was quietly eating her supper, and he made a speech that she would later describe as the most useful thing he ever did for her. "The girl is gone," he said. "Dead or departed, it makes no difference. A person who hides like this, who lives like an animal in a hole in the ground, is not the kind of person this community needs to concern itself with. Whatever she is or was, she is no longer our problem." Astrid heard every word. She set down her spoon. She looked at the ceiling, at the packed earth and cottonwood poles above her head, at the thin seam of daylight that came through the insulated gap where the chimney pipe met the roof frame. She thought of her father. She thought of the letter in the tin box. She thought of what he had written at the end, in that careful, measured hand, "I believe in being ready." She picked up her spoon and finished her supper. Through November and December, the dugout became a home. This was the part that surprised her, not the survival, which she had always believed she could manage, but the way the space transformed around her as she worked. She had expected something bare and desperate, a hole in the ground that kept her alive and nothing more. What she built instead was something else entirely. Halvard came when he could. He brought things she could not make, or find herself a small cast-iron stove that burned wood with a miserly efficiency that seemed almost miraculous, its design. Halvard's own, refined over 40 years. Glass for a window set into the south-facing entrance corridor so that winter sunlight came in at an angle for 3 hours in the middle of the day. A proper door hung on good hinges that sealed tight against the cold. She built furniture from cottonwood she hauled from the creek 3 miles away, working by lantern light on the evenings when the cold kept her inside. A bed frame built into the east wall raised off the ground. A table and 2 chairs. Shelves that ran the length of the north wall, already beginning to fill with the things she was putting by. The root cellar went deeper than the main room, cut into the hillside at an angle that kept it at a steady cold temperature without freezing solid. She filled it through the autumn with everything she could produce or procure: dried beans, smoked rabbit, preserved vegetables from the hidden garden she had planted in the lee of the hill where the soil was better than it looked, and the rock formation blocked the prevailing wind. The earth maintained its 55 degrees just as her father had written. The stove burning efficiently brought the room up to a comfortable warmth with a fraction of the wood that a surface cabin would have required. She kept 2 weeks of fuel stacked inside at all times. More in the concealed cache she had built into the hillside 40 yards from the entrance. She read in the evenings. She had managed to take 3 books from the homestead before Helga arrived, tucked inside her coat when she left the only thing she had been able to conceal: her father's Bible, a Norwegian almanac from 1879, a battered copy of an agricultural survey of Dakota Territory that she had read so many times she could recite sections of it from memory. By December, the smoke from nowhere had become a running joke in Millhaven. People talked about it in the mercantile, laughed about it in the saloon. Some said it was a ghost. Some said it was a witch. Some said it was the earth itself burning, which made no sense but had a satisfying dramatic quality. One man said maybe Mayor Drummond just couldn't find his own backside with both hands. And everyone laughed at that, including people who would never have said such a thing to Drummond's face. Drummond heard the laughter, and it made him furious in the way that only impotent authority can be made furious. He knew the girl was out there. He knew she was alive. And he could not find her, which meant she was making him look foolish, which was the one thing Silas Drummond could not forgive. He told himself he would find her in the spring, when the snow melted and the ground was soft and readable, and there was nowhere left to hide. He would find her, and he would deal with the situation properly, and that would be the end of it. January came in hard and stayed. The temperature dropped to 30 below and held there for 2 weeks. The kind of cold that kills cattle in their barns and cracks the wood in a man's cabin walls and turns the air itself into something that feels solid, something that pushes back. The kind of cold that reminds you every single time that the prairie does not tolerate mistakes. In Millhaven, people stayed inside and burned wood and worried about their fuel supplies and told each other that it would break. Soon it always broke. This was Dakota. You just had to wait. On the hillside southeast of town, Astrid Voss sat in her 55-degree room and read her agricultural survey by the light of a tallow candle and was in every meaningful sense of the word comfortable. She was aware of this. She was aware of the contrast between what was happening inside her home and what was happening outside it, and she did not feel superior about it. Her father had not raised her to feel superior about anything, but she did feel something that was close to clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you understand precisely where you are and how you got there and what it cost and what it means. She had lost everything that could be taken from her. A home, a father, a place in the community, a name that meant something. All of it stripped away by a woman with a legal document and a man with a loud opinion and a town that could not be bothered. What remained was everything that couldn't be taken. The knowledge in her hands. The skills her father had given her. The 30 acres of worthless, rock-strewn hillside that Erling Voss had quietly registered in his daughter's name because he understood that the things that look worthless are sometimes the things that save you. And one more thing. Old Halvard Bjorn had come in the first week of January, fighting through the cold on feet that were not as reliable as they once had been, arriving at her door with frost in his beard and the expression of a man who has something important to say and has been composing it for a long walk. He came inside. He looked around the finished dugout for a long time, moving slowly through the space, running his hands along the walls, checking the seal on the door, examining the draw of the stove. "Your father would be proud," he said finally. "This is better than anything I ever built. Warmer, tighter, more invisible." He turned to look at her, his pale eyes serious. "They'll never find you here." "No," Astrid said. "But someday," Halvard said, "alone, they may need to." She waited. "I've lived in Dakota Territory for 33 years, he said. "I've seen 7 bad winters. I know what a bad winter looks like when it's building." He moved to the small window and looked out at the January sky, which was the color of old iron, and showed no intention of changing. "There's something coming. Not tomorrow, not next week, but before spring. The kind of storm that doesn't negotiate." He turned back to her. "I've only seen its like once before, 30 years ago, before there was a town here. I was the only man in my group who survived." The room was very quiet. "How?" Astrid asked. He looked at the walls around them, at the packed earth, in the sod blocks, in the cottonwood poles, and the small stove throwing its steady warmth into the enclosed space. "The same way you're surviving now," he said. After he left, Astrid stood in the middle of her room for a longer time about him. Then she went to her root cellar and took stock of everything she had. She made a list. She calculated quantities and burn rates and consumption estimates with the same methodical precision her father had taught her. She was going to need more. More food, more wood, more of everything. She started the next morning. She told herself she was being practical. She told herself she was simply being careful. She told herself that Halvard was 71 years old and his bones ached and old men sometimes read signs in the weather that were not there. But she filled her root cellar until there was no more room. She built a second cache in the hillside hidden behind the rocks accessible from outside. She put by enough food for a month for one person, then for 2, then for 5, then without quite letting herself think about why for 10 or 15 or more. She told herself she was being practical. She was. But she was also her father's daughter, and her father had always believed that the things you prepare for are rarely the things that happen, and the things that happen are the things you prepared for without knowing it. The smoke rose every morning, thin, gray, rising from nowhere, from the frozen ground, from the invisible home of a girl that the town of Millhaven had decided did not exist. January deepened into February, and somewhere over the northern plains moving south with a patience that nothing human could match, the great blizzard of 1887 was building. February came in quietly. That was the deceptive thing about it. After the brutal lockdown of January, after the 2 weeks of 30 below that had kept even the hardiest men off the streets of Millhaven and driven the cattle into the back corners of their barns, where they stood pressed together and shivering, February arrived with something almost resembling gentleness. The temperature climbed back to single digits, then above zero, then on a Tuesday in the second week all the way up to 22 degrees, which felt, after what had come before, almost warm. People came out of their houses. They stood on the boardwalk in front of the mercantile and turned their faces toward the thin winter sun and told each other that the worst was over. They talked about spring. They talked about planting schedules and seed orders and the price of wheat in Sioux Falls. They talked about everything except the one thing that several of them in their quieter moments were still thinking about. The smoke on the hillside was still rising. Every morning without fail, that thin gray thread lifted from the southeast hill and dissipated into the cold air above Millhaven like a rumor that refused to die. People had stopped talking about it publicly. Drummond had made it clear that the subject bored him, but they noticed it. Farmers on their way to their barns in the pre-dawn dark noticed it. Women at their kitchen windows noticed it. The old men who gathered at the back of the mercantile around the heating stove and talked about nothing in particular most definitely noticed it, and they thought about it more than they admitted. A girl had gone out into the Dakota winter with nothing but the clothes on her back, and something was still burning out there. On the hillside, Astrid Voss noticed February's false warmth and did not trust it for a single moment. She had her father's almanacs. She had Halvard's warnings, which she kept returning to in her mind, the way you return to a splinter you cannot quite reach, uncomfortable, persistent, impossible to ignore. She had her own observations accumulated over 17 years of living close to this land, of watching the way the light moved and the way the animals behaved and the way the wind came around the rocks at different times of year. The animals were wrong. It was the thing she kept coming back to. The rabbits had moved downslope in January, which made sense. They always moved to lower ground in heavy cold. But they hadn't come back up when the temperature lifted in February. They were still down in the creek bottom deeper than she'd ever seen them go, tucked into the densest brush along the waterline, with a purposefulness that looked less like ordinary winter behavior and more like something that understood, in whatever way a rabbit understands things, that the exposure was not yet over. The birds were wrong, too. A flock of snow buntings had come through in late January, which was normal enough, but they had flown straight through without stopping, which was not. Snow buntings stopped. They fed on the grass seeds that poked through the drifts. They rested. They lingered. These ones had not lingered. They had crossed the sky above the hill in a tight, purposeful formation that said, in the language of wings and instinct, that there was somewhere more urgent to be. Astrid added wood to her cache. She smoked more meat. She calculated and recalculated, running numbers in her head, the way her father had taught her, not with anxiety, but with precision, the way a good farmer approaches every problem as an equation to be balanced rather than a catastrophe to be feared. She was ready for something. She did not know exactly what. She kept getting ready anyway. It was on the 14th of February. She knew the date because she kept a careful calendar scratched into a cottonwood board above her bed, that she went to find Halvard Bjorn and found instead what she had been quietly dreading. She had not seen him in 3 weeks. This was not entirely unusual. The distance between his homestead and her dugout was 5 miles of open ground, and in hard January weather, 5 miles was genuinely dangerous for a man of 71. She had not worried exactly. She had noted the absence and told herself it was the cold, it was sensible, he was being careful, he would come when he could. But 3 weeks was long, and February's false warmth had opened the trail between them, and she had no more reason to wait. She left before first light, which was when the air was coldest, but also when the visibility was best, a clear sky above, and good hard snow that took a track and held it so she could find her way back even if the weather changed. She moved quickly. 5 miles on snowshoes across open country, following the line of the creek where the cottonwoods broke the wind, then up the long slope to Halvard's claim on the north side of the ridge. She knew something was wrong before she reached the door. The stovepipe above his cabin roof was cold. No smoke, not even a trace. In February in Dakota, a cold stovepipe over an occupied house meant one of two things, and one of them she could not afford to think about yet. She pushed the door open. The cabin was dim and cold, the temperature inside only a few degrees warmer than the air outside. The stove had been out for at least 2 days. The ash in the firebox was stone cold when she touched it. The water in the bucket by the door had frozen solid. Halvard was in his bed under every blanket. He owned his breathing, shallow and fast, his skin hot and dry, and she pressed her hand to his forehead. His eyes were open but not entirely focused, tracking her face with the effortful attention of a man pushing back against something that wanted to pull him under. "Astrid," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I'm here," she said. "I'm going to get the fire going." "Been down 2 days," he said. "Maybe 3. Lost track." She built the fire first, had the stove going in 8 minutes, heating water in 12. She got him to drink not easy. He kept drifting and examined him as well as she could with what she had. The fever was high. His lungs sounded wrong, a wet rattling quality, when she pressed her ear to his chest that she recognized and did not like. He had not eaten in at least 2 days, possibly 3. She sat back on her heels and thought. She could stay here. She had her pack. She could manage a few days in his cabin, get him stable, see if the fever broke. But his cabin was cold and drafty, poorly sealed compared to her dugout burning fuel at 5 times the rate. She would be fighting the cold on top of fighting his illness, and her supplies were 5 miles away. Or she could move him 5 miles. A man of 71 with a high fever and compromised lungs on a sled over open ground in February. It would be difficult, it might be dangerous, but her home was warm and well-stocked and well-sealed, and it would stay that way regardless of what the weather did, and she could not say the same about this cabin. She built a sled from his 2 best boards and the leather harness she found hanging in his lean-to. She padded it with his blankets and packed his few medical supplies, a bottle of turpentine, some willow bark, a tin of the pine salve he used for chest complaints into her pack. She wrapped him in every piece of fabric in the cabin and got him onto the sled, which was harder than she had anticipated and took 20 minutes and more of her strength than she had expected to spend. Then she pulled him 5 miles through the Dakota cold. She thought about her father while she walked. She thought about the letter in the tin box, the careful handwriting, the matter-of-fact love of a man who prepared for things he hoped would never happen. She thought about what he had written, "I believe in being ready." She thought about what Halvard had told her on the day he inspected the finished dugout. "They'll never find you here. But someday they may need to." She walked. The old man on the sled behind her drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering in Norwegian, sometimes in English, sometimes in what she gradually realized was a mixture of both that followed some internal logic she couldn't quite track. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes. She got him inside, got him into her bed, the one built into the east wall with the buffalo hide beneath the mattress for extra insulation. Got the stove burning hot and the room warming fast. Got willow bark tea into him, one careful spoonful at a time, the way you dose something that is only partly present. And then in the small hours of the morning, when his breathing had steadied and his fever had begun barely tentatively to loosen its grip, Halvard Bjorn opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of the dugout above him and began to talk. He talked about 1856. She had not asked. She was sitting in the chair beside the bed, watching him, monitoring his breathing, half asleep herself. He just began in the quiet voice of a man who has carried something for a long time and finds in his weakened state that the weight of it is more than he wants to bear alone. He had been 22 years old. He had come to Dakota Territory with 5 other men Norwegians, all of them young and strong, and convinced in the way that young, strong men are convinced that the land would yield to them because they intended it to. They had built 3 surface cabins in a cluster on the open prairie north of where Millhaven now stood, and they had prepared for winter with the confidence of people who did not yet understand what Dakota winter actually meant. The storm had come in January. He described it the way survivors describe catastrophes, not with drama, but with a kind of numb precision, as though the mind has processed the event so many times that it has worn smooth the rough edges, gone but the shape of it permanent and exact. The temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. The wind had hit like a wall. The snow had come so thick and so fast that visibility dropped to 0 inside of 20 minutes. 4 of the 5 other men had died. One in the storm itself, lost between the cabins, found frozen 10 feet from his own door when the snow melted in April. 2 in their cabin when the roof collapsed under the weight of accumulated drifts on the 3rd day. 1 more from the cold that invaded the surviving cabin through every crack and gap, slow and inevitable, over the 7 days the storm lasted. Halvard had survived because he had spent the previous summer with a Lakota family whose camp was near his claim, and they had shown him something. Not lectured him, not formally instructed him, simply shown him the way you show someone by living the way their winter shelters worked, built into the earth, using the ground's own warmth, invisible from above, immune to the wind because they were below it. He had dug a shallow pit in the corner of his cabin and covered himself with everything he had. It was a crude version, nothing like what they had built together on the hillside, but it had been enough. The earth around and below him had held his temperature. He had survived. I came back in the spring, he said. His voice was still rough, still hoarse, but steadier now, more present. I spent the whole summer doing it properly, the way they'd shown me. I've been underground every winter since, Rabato. Astrid was quiet for a moment. You've been sleeping in a dugout for 30 years. Living in one, he said. Not quite like this. Mine's rougher, but the principle's the same. He turned his head on the pillow to look at her. That's why I knew your father's idea was right, and why I wanted to make sure you built it correctly. You've been waiting 30 years to teach someone, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I've been waiting 30 years for the right someone, he said, and for the right storm. The room was warm and still. Outside, the February air pressed against the sod walls and found no purchase. Is it coming soon? Astrid asked. Yes, Halvard said. I can feel it the way I felt the other one. In here. He pressed one knotted hand to his chest. It's bigger. I think it's bigger than the one in 56. She sat with that for a while. Rest, she said finally. He closed his eyes. Within a few minutes, his breathing had deepened and moved into something that was real sleep, rather than the shallow, restless, near consciousness he'd been stuck in. His fever was still present, but retreating, degree by degree, as the warmth of the dugout and the willow bark did their work. Astrid went to her supply shelves and began making new calculations. In Millhaven, February was being kind, and people were being foolish about it. This was not entirely their fault. Dakota winters created a particular psychological pattern in the people who lived through them. The longer and harder the cold, the greater the hunger for any sign that it was ending. A few warm days in February could make a whole town believe the worst was over, not because the evidence supported this belief, but because they needed it to be true. Mayor Silas Drummond was feeling the warmth along with everyone else. He had spent January in a state of low-grade fury about the smoke, about his failed searches, about the general humiliation of being unable to locate a 17-year-old girl on 30 acres of open ground, and the lifting temperature lifted his mood along with it. He told himself the matter was resolved. The girl had clearly managed to survive the worst of it, which was irritating, but she would surface eventually, and when she did, he would deal with the land question properly. In the meantime, he had other matters. He had the spring land sales to organize the new schoolhouse, to fund the continuing question of the railroad spur that the county commissioners kept promising and failing to deliver. He was a busy man with real responsibilities, and the Voss girl had already consumed more of his time and attention than she deserved. He almost put her out of his mind completely. And then Helga Voss came to see him. She came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of February, arriving at his office with her coat buttoned to her chin and the particular expression of a woman who has spent considerable time rehearsing what she intends to say. Drummond received her with the careful courtesy he extended to all the widows in his district, which was considerable. Dakota widowhood was not uncommon, and the women it produced were a constituency he preferred to keep on his side. Mrs. Voss, he said. It's legal, Helga said, and there was a flatness in her voice when she said it that told him she had already consulted someone and already knew the answer. I had an attorney look at it. Erling filed it properly. It's hers. Then what do you want from me? Helga was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted slightly, still controlled, still precise, but with something underneath it that was not quite desperation and not quite greed, but lived somewhere in that neighborhood. She's living on that land, Helga said. That's where the smoke is coming from. And if she's living there, then she has established residency. And if she's established residency on land that is legally hers, then her position is significantly stronger than it was when she was simply a displaced miner with no legal claim to anything. She paused. I want you to go out there, find her, make her understand that she should come back to town, that she can stay with one of the church families until spring, that she should relinquish the land claim in exchange for a settlement, something reasonable. A settlement, Drummond said. A sum of money, enough to start somewhere else, somewhere that isn't here. Drummond sat back in his chair. He looked at the woman across his desk, at her folded hands, at her straight back, at the careful way she was presenting this as a reasonable business proposition rather than what it was. And if she declines, he said, then make her understand that declining is not in her interest. Helga's eyes met his. You're the mayor, Silas. You have ways of making things clear. He said he would think about it. After she left, he sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about the document Helga had brought, and more specifically, he thought about Erling Voss filing a land claim in his daughter's name 18 months before his death. He thought about what that meant. A careful man making careful arrangements. A man who had looked at his situation and seen something that Drummond had not seen or had not wanted to see. He thought about the smoke on the hillside. He thought about a 17-year-old girl alone in a Dakota winter in a structure that his best trackers could not find, keeping a fire burning every single day for 5 months. He was not a man given to doubt. He had built his entire career on the confidence of his own judgment. But sitting in his office on that February afternoon with Helga Voss's envelope on the desk in front of him and the thin winter sunlight coming through the window at an angle that made everything look slightly unreal, he felt something shift in his certainty. Only slightly. Not enough to change his behavior, not yet. But the shift was there. He put the envelope in his drawer and told himself he would deal with it in the spring. March arrived. The first 2 days of March were the warmest days Millhaven had seen since October. The temperature climbed to 38 degrees, which felt almost like a thaw, and the snow on the south-facing roofs began to drip for the first time since November, and people said, spring, finally spring. The third day of March began the same way. The morning was still, clear sky, a pale sun that had real warmth in it, or felt like it did. Drummond walked to his office without a coat, which was the kind of recklessness that February warmth provokes in men who should know better. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and breathed the air and told himself that the winter of 1886 to 1887 was behind them. At 11 in the morning, the wind changed. It came from the northwest, and it came fast, not building gradually the way most weather built in Dakota, but arriving all at once fully formed, as though it had been waiting behind the horizon for exactly the right moment. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 40 minutes. The sky in the northwest turned a color that old-timers would later describe as the color of a bruise, a deep blue-green gray that had nothing natural about it. By noon, the first snow was falling, not drifting down the way ordinary snow falls, driving sideways, dense and fine as sand carried on a wind that had abandoned the usual range of prairie weather and entered into something that was closer to a physical force than mere meteorological event. You could lean into this wind and it would hold you up. You could cup your hand in it and fill your palm in seconds with snow so fine it felt like powder. The temperature continued to drop. By 2 o'clock, it was 10 below zero. By 4, 20 below. The wind was doing things to the snow that changed the landscape entirely, picking it up, moving it, piling it against every vertical surface until the buildings of Millhaven began to lose their shapes, began to blur and round, and become something more like geological features than structures built by human hands. Mayor Drummond organized quickly. He had people in the street directing families to the larger buildings, trying to consolidate the warmth. He got the children into the schoolhouse. He kept the mercantile open and burning. He was doing, in other words, all the things that a competent man of authority should do in an emergency. It wasn't enough. By evening of the first day, the drifts against the buildings were 6 feet high. By morning of the second day, 3 of the smaller homes had collapsed under the weight of the accumulated snow on their roofs. By the third day, the schoolhouse roof was groaning, and Drummond had moved the children again into the mercantile, which was larger and better built, but whose fuel supply was not designed for 20 people burning around the clock. The cold got into everything. It found the gaps in the walls that summer never revealed. It seeped through the floors. It crept under the doors despite the rags stuffed in every crack. The buildings of Millhaven, which everyone had considered solid and adequate and more than sufficient for a Dakota winter, were revealing themselves to be something built for ordinary winters, for the winters that most years brought, not for this, not for whatever this was. The livestock began dying on the third day, cattle in barns that were simply not insulated against temperatures that dropped past 40 below and kept going. Horses, hogs. The economic damage was catastrophic and accumulating, but it was the human cost that was making Drummond's hands shake when he thought about it in the quiet moments between organizing and directing and trying to project the calm authority that he felt less and less. 4 people died in the first 4 days. An elderly man in a house on the north end of town whose chimney blocked in the night and whose stove went cold. A woman trying to get from her house to her neighbor's 50 yards, nothing, no distance at all in ordinary weather, who lost her way in the whiteout and was found against the fence on the wrong side of the street. Two children in a home whose walls gave way slowly, inexorably, until the ceiling followed. 13 more by the seventh day. 17 dead. Buildings failing. Fuel running out. Food holding barely, but the cold was eating through it faster than anyone had anticipated, because cold bodies burn calories at a rate that no one had planned for. And Drummond was running out of answers. He moved through the surviving buildings of Millhaven on the seventh night, checking on the families consolidated there, counting heads, estimating supplies, trying to calculate how many more days this could go on. The wind was still running at 50 miles an hour. The temperature was still holding at 45 below. There was no sign of the storm breaking, no change in the color of the sky, no shift in the wind that might suggest what was beyond it. He went back to his own building, the land office and town hall, combined the largest and best constructed structure in Millhaven, and found Helga Voss waiting for him. She was sitting in the chair by his stove. She had her coat still on, even inside, which told him how cold the room had gotten. She looked like a woman who had traveled a long distance, not physically, but internally, arriving somewhere she had not expected to be. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes were different from the last time he'd seen her. The controlled precision was gone. What was there instead was something raw and more honest fear, and something adjacent to shame, and the particular expression of a person who has run out of moves. "My building won't last another 2 days," she said. "The east wall is moving." Drummond sat down heavily behind his desk. "I know. I looked at it this afternoon." "I need to tell you something," Helga said. "Mrs. Voss, she's alive." Helga's voice was flat, not the controlled flatness of their last meeting, but the flatness of someone who has given up managing their words. "Astrid, she's been on that hillside all winter. The smoke is from her. She has a shelter there underground built into the hill. I don't know exactly where, but I know the 30 acres. She paused. "She's been alive and warm all winter while we've been—" She stopped, looked at her hands. "While we've been surviving," she said quietly, "while 17 people have been dying." Drummond said nothing for a long moment. He stood up and walked to his window. Outside was white and nothing, the storm filling every inch of the visible world with its indifferent motion. Somewhere out there, 5 miles away or thereabouts, a thin thread of smoke was rising from a hillside. He couldn't see it. The storm was too thick, the distance too great, the world reduced to a few feet of visibility in any direction. But he knew it was there. He thought about the searches he had led, the hours on that hillside, the frustration, the certainty that the girl was hiding something criminal, something defiant, something that needed to be stopped. He thought about what he had said on the street the day she left. A decent girl would have made herself useful, and the particular satisfaction he had felt saying it, the ease of it, the way it had made the crowd nod, and the way that nodding had confirmed his sense that he was right. He thought about 17 dead. He thought about the envelope in his desk drawer, about Erling Voss filing a land claim for his daughter in the quiet, careful way of a man who does not trust what is coming. He thought about smoke rising from nowhere. The girl had not been hiding. She had been building. She had been preparing. She had done in the face of everything exactly what the land required and what the winter demanded, and she had done it alone at 17 with no help from anyone in Millhaven except an old man who nobody listened to. And now the old man's student was the only person in the county with shelter adequate to what was happening outside. Drummond turned away from the window. "How many can we move?" he said. Helga looked up at him. "If we go out there," he said, "how many can we bring with us?" She understood immediately. "Everyone who can walk, and some who can't if we have something to carry them on." 23, Drummond said. He had been counting all day. He knew his numbers. 23 people still living in structures that will hold. "I can't take more than that without killing someone in transit." He was already moving, already pulling his coat from the hook, already thinking about the route, about the wind direction, about the drifts that would have formed along the creek bank and which way around them would be fastest. "You think she'll take us in?" Helga said. It was not quite a question. Drummond thought about what he knew of Astrid Voss. He thought about the letter she had not sent, the complaint she had not filed, the argument she had not made. He thought about 17-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her home with the clothes on her back and had responded by building something extraordinary and invisible and warm, who had spent 5 months being called an animal and a vagrant, by people she could have confronted at any time and had not. "Yes," he said, "I think she'll take us in." He put his coat on. He went to the door. Outside, the blizzard was a wall of white, and the cold was a physical thing pressing against him the moment he stepped across the threshold, finding the gaps in his coat, looking for the warmth he was carrying. He looked southeast, toward the hill. Somewhere out there, through 50 miles an hour of wind and driving snow and 45 below cold, a thin thread of smoke was rising from the frozen ground. He had spent months trying to find it and put it out. Now he was going to follow it to stay alive. She saw them coming from half a mile away. Not clearly, the storm had not broken, not yet, and the visibility was still measured in yards rather than distance, but well enough. Shapes in the white, a dark column of people moving against the wind, leaning into it at an angle that said they had been walking a long time and were using the last of what they had. She counted them through the small, south-facing window of her entrance corridor, pressing her face close to the cold glass, breathing fog onto it and wiping it clear. 23 people, moving slowly, some supporting others. She had been watching for them since the 5th day of the storm. Not because she had expected them exactly, but because Halvard had taught her that preparation means accounting for the things you hope will not happen, and somewhere in the back of her careful mind, behind all the calculations of food and fuel and floor space, she had run the numbers on Millhaven. She knew the buildings. She had grown up in this town. She knew which ones would hold and which ones wouldn't, and she had done the arithmetic of what 45 below zero cold does to structures built for ordinary winters, and the arithmetic had come out dark. She had known this day might come. She had not known if she would open the door when it did. Now she stood in the entrance of her dugout in the narrow corridor where the winter sun came through 3 hours a day and the temperature held at 38 degrees, regardless of what was happening outside. And she watched 23 people fight their way across the last quarter mile of open ground toward her hill. Halvard was awake in the bed against the east wall. His fever had broken 4 days ago, and he had recovered with the stubborn efficiency of a man who has survived too much to be undone by a lung complaint. He was not strong yet, not by any measure, but he was lucid and present and watching her from across the room with his pale eyes that missed nothing. "How many?" he said. 23. She turned from the window. "I can see Drummond at the front." Halvard was quiet for a moment, and behind him, she looked again, counted, recognized. A family from the north end of town, the school teacher and her husband, the blacksmith, 2 of the men who had ridden on the search parties in November, who had walked across this very roof without knowing it. And there near the back, supported on one side by a younger woman Astrid didn't recognize, moving with the careful, deliberate steps of someone who was conserving everything Helga Voss. Astrid watched her stepmother cross the open ground, watched the way she moved head down against the wind, her coat pulled close, her whole bearing stripped of the precise, controlled quality that had always characterized her. She looked like what she was, a woman in her late 40s, exhausted, cold, making her way toward the shelter of a person she had wronged. "Helga is with them," Astrid said. Halvard said nothing. He just watched her. Astrid stood at the window for another moment. The column of people had reached the base of the hill now and was beginning the climb, not a steep climb, but steep enough that the wind hit differently here, more direct, no longer deflected by the creek bank and the cottonwoods. She could see them struggling with it, could see a child, small bundled, so completely in wrapping that only a face was visible, being lifted and carried by a man who was himself barely managing the grade. She went to the door. She unlatched it and pushed it open and stepped out into the entry and then out onto the sheltered ledge below the false rock face where the entrance was concealed, and she stood there in the wind and watched them come. Drummond saw her first. He stopped walking for just a moment. A full stop, involuntary, the way a man stops when something he has been working toward suddenly becomes real. Then he kept moving, and the column behind him kept moving, and in another 3 minutes he was standing 10 feet from her on the snow-packed slope, and they looked at each other. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. His face was raw with cold, his lips cracked, his eyes carrying the particular hollow quality of a man who has been managing a catastrophe and has run out of ways to manage it. His coat was good. He was not a man who skimped on his own equipment, but even good coats had limits, and he had been in the cold a long time. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was steadier than she had expected. Mayor Drummond, she said. The wind drove between them. Behind him, 22 people waited in a ragged cluster, pressing together for warmth, their faces turned toward her with the kind of attention that people give to the one thing standing between them and dying. You called me an animal, Astrid said. You said no decent person hides like this. Drummond did not flinch. He had been a man of considerable pride for all of his adult life, and pride has its own kind of spine, and his was still there even when everything else had been stripped back by cold and failure and 17 dead. I was wrong, he said. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what I said and what I did and what I allowed to happen. I cannot make that right standing here in the wind. He paused. But there are children behind me. There are people who will not last another night without shelter. I am asking you. I am asking. Please. Astrid looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the 22 people behind him. The children she counted were 4. The elderly 2. The rest were working-age men and women who looked every one of them as though the working age had temporarily left them. Her eyes found Helga near the back. Helga was looking at her directly. Not pleading, not performing, not arranging her face into anything calculated, just looking. The way a person looks when they are past the point of managing how they appear and have arrived somewhere more fundamental than that. Come in, Astrid said. All of you. There's room. Getting 23 people into a space built for one was an exercise in mathematics and human geometry. The main room was 12 feet wide and 20 feet deep, which was not a large room, but it was a sealed room, and in the arithmetic of winter survival, sealed matters more than large. She had them sit along the walls first. The children closest to the stove, the elderly next the able-bodied adults in the corridor, and the entrance chamber where the temperature was lower but still survivable. She opened the root cellar and moved supplies out to create additional floor space, stacking provisions along the walls of the main room with the efficiency of someone who had been organizing tight spaces for months. Drummond helped without being asked. He saw what she was doing and understood it and simply began doing it alongside her. Moving crates, rolling barrels, creating order from the sudden chaos of 23 cold bodies in a small underground room. He did not offer opinions. He did not suggest alternatives. He moved what she indicated needed moving and stopped when she indicated it was done. The children warmed fastest. Children always do. Their metabolisms are furnaces, and the transition from dangerous cold to a room holding 55 degrees and climbing felt to them like summer. And within 40 minutes, they had shed their outer wrappings and were sitting up and looking around with the alert curiosity of people discovering somewhere new. The adults took longer. Some of them were borderline frostbite on the hands and feet, the beginning of the dull, confused state that cold produces when it has been working on a person for too long. Astrid moved through them methodically, not frantically, not with the performed urgency of someone trying to demonstrate competence, but with the quiet efficiency of someone who has thought about this problem and knows what needs to be done in what order. Halvard watched from his bed and said nothing. His presence in the room had its own quality. The old man propped against the wall in the bed built into the east side of the main room, watching 23 people organize themselves into the space he had helped design, his pale eyes moving slowly from face to face with an expression that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sorrow, but something that held both. Drummond saw him, stopped, looked at the old man in the bed, at the man he had spent 30 years treating as a harmless eccentric, as an artifact of an earlier era that the town had politely tolerated and essentially ignored. Halvard, he said, not Mr. Bjorn, just Halvard, the way you say the name of someone you should have treated better. The old man looked at him. Silas, he said simply. That was all. But something in those two names exchanged across that small room held a whole history. The first night was the hardest. Not because of the cold, the dugout held its temperature, the stove burned steady and efficient, on a fraction of the fuel that the Millhaven buildings had been consuming, and by midnight the main room had climbed to 60 degrees, which felt almost tropical to people who had spent a week in buildings where the interior temperature had dropped to 20. The hardest part was the proximity. 23 people who had spent their whole lives maintaining the particular distances of prairie social life, the distances of property and reputation, and the careful hierarchies of a small town, suddenly compressed into a single room where there was no space for any of that. The blacksmith, a man named Gruber, who had ridden on Drummond's third search party, found himself sitting 2 feet from a woman whose name he didn't know because she lived on the edge of the county and came to town only occasionally and had never seemed to merit introduction. They talked for 3 hours that first night, haltingly at first, and then not haltingly. And by the time they slept, they knew each other's stories, and the distance between them was gone in a way that would not come back. This happened everywhere in the room. Over and over, the compression of space forcing the compression of distance, people discovering each other across the barriers that ordinary life maintains between people who live close together and remain essentially strangers. Astrid moved through it all. She distributed food at regular intervals, not generously, not yet, not until she had a precise accounting of supply against need, portioning it with a care that was not miserly, but was mathematical, the way you manage resources when you cannot predict the endpoint. Hot broth first for the ones who needed it most. Then bread baked in the small Dutch oven that fit over the stove lid. Then the preserved meat rationed in portions that were enough to sustain without depleting. She answered questions when people asked them. How had she built this? How long had she been here? How had she known the storm was coming? She answered simply without drama, referring to Halvard's teaching and her father's letter in the behavior of the rabbits in late January. People listened to her in a way they had not listened to her before, with the particular attention that competence earns when it is the thing standing between you and dying. On the second night, one of the children, a girl of about 6 with dark braids and a serious face, came and sat next to Astrid while she was tending the stove and watched her work for a while. Did you build this all by yourself? The girl asked. Mostly, Astrid said. Mr. Bjorn helped me. The girl looked across the room at Halvard. He's old, she said. He is, Astrid agreed. He's also the reason I'm alive. So is my father, and he's been gone since September. The people who teach us things don't stop helping us just because they're gone. The girl considered this with the serious attention of a 6-year-old applying herself to a difficult idea. Then she nodded and went back to her mother. The third night was when Helga Voss stopped pretending. She had been careful until then. Careful in the way she had always been careful, managing her proximity to Astrid, keeping herself peripheral, not seeking interaction, and not avoiding it, maintaining the controlled distance that had been her primary mode of being in the world for as long as Astrid had known her. Even here, even in this room where control was not really available to anyone, she had managed a version of it. On the third night it ran out. Astrid was at the shelf arranging the next morning's provisions when she became aware that Helga had moved to stand near her. Not beside her exactly, a little behind and to the left, in the way of someone who has come close but hasn't quite committed to being there. Astrid did not look up from what she was doing. The room around them was quieter than it had been, most people sleeping, the children completely gone, the adults in the particular heavy stillness of bodies that have used everything they have. The stove ticked and settled. Halvard's slow breathing came from the east wall. I found the letter, Helga said. Her voice was low. Not a whisper. She wasn't trying to be secretive, just low in the way of a person speaking something that doesn't need to be announced. Erling's letter to you. I knew Halvard had something. I looked after the funeral. She paused. I didn't know what it said. I only knew it existed. Astrid was still. She had not looked up. I think I always knew what he was doing, Helga said. The trip to Sioux Falls, the questions he asked about this land. He was not a secretive man. It was not natural to him, the secrecy, so when he tried to be, it showed. Another pause. I thought I was smarter than him. I thought I had arranged everything properly. I thought. She stopped. In the silence, the stove settled again. Someone across the room shifted in their sleep. I did not love him, Helga said. I want you to know that I know that. I was lonely after my first husband, and I was practical, and Erling had land and a good name, and I thought that was enough. I told myself it was enough. Her voice was very flat now, the flatness of honest accounting rather than controlled performance. He was a good man. He deserved better than I gave him. Astrid set down the tin she was holding. She turned around. Helga was looking at her directly. No arrangement in her face, no composition, no careful management of what she was showing. Just a woman of 47 in a coat she had been wearing for 8 days, standing in the underground room of the stepdaughter she had thrown out in September, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Astrid looked at her for a moment. Then she reached out and put her hand on Helga's shoulder. Just that. No words, no absolution, no performance of forgiveness that would have been false at this stage, and both of them would have known it. Just a hand on a shoulder in the dark, in the warmth that the earth was providing to people who had not earned it and who were receiving it anyway. Helga's breath caught once sharply. Then she steadied. "Thank you," she said, very quietly. Astrid nodded and turned back to the shelf. They did not speak of it again. But something in the room between them had shifted. Not resolved, not healed, nothing so simple or so fast, but shifted. The way a locked thing shifts when the right pressure is applied to the right point, not opening, but releasing the mechanism, moving from seized to merely closed. The days found their rhythm. This was the thing Astrid had not anticipated, not the logistics which she had calculated and recalculated and managed with reasonable success, but the way that 23 people in an enclosed space over 2 weeks created something. Not just survival, something else. The school teacher, a woman named Mrs. Larkin, who had been in Millhaven for only 2 years and who Astrid knew only slightly, organized the children into lessons in the mornings. Reading numbers, geography conducted in whispers because the room was small, illustrated with nothing, because there was nothing entirely from the contents of the teacher's own mind, which turned out to be considerable. The children bent over their imaginary slates with an attention they had never given the actual schoolhouse, because learning was suddenly interesting in the way that everything is interesting when the ordinary world has been stripped away. Gruber the blacksmith turned out to be a storyteller. He had a gift for it, the way some people do, a natural sense of pace, an instinct for the moment that needs slowing, and the moment that needs speed. And in the evenings, when the room was fed and warm and the stove was settled, he told stories. About his childhood in Wisconsin, about the first time he came west, about things that had happened on the prairie, some funny and some not, all of them true or mostly true, or at least true in the ways that matter. People laughed, more than Astrid had expected. Genuine laughter, not the performed kind, the kind that comes from people who have been frightened together long enough that the fear has become a thing they share, and sharing it makes room for everything else. Drummond did not tell stories. He was not that kind of man. But he worked, steadily every day, without complaint and without direction, doing whatever needed doing, splitting wood from the concealed cache she had built into the hillside, carrying water from the snow. She melted in the large pot, making the twice-daily check on the chimney pipe to ensure it stayed clear of drifting snow. He was not trying to demonstrate anything or earn anything or position himself. He was simply working in the way of a man who has found late in his reckoning that work is the most honest thing available to him. On the fifth evening, he came to sit near Astrid while she was doing her calculations for the next day's provisions. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "The land registration. Your father is filing in Sioux Falls." He kept his voice even. "I knew about it. Helga told me in February. I put it in my drawer and told myself I would deal with it in the spring." He paused. "What I mean is, I was going to use it against you. Find a way to complicate it, delay it, make it difficult enough that you might relinquish it to make the difficulty stop." Astrid looked at him. "I'm telling you because you should know," he said, "not because I expect anything from telling you. Not forgiveness, or I'm telling you, because you're the kind of person who deserves to know the truth of her situation, and you've been operating without the full truth, and that's partly my doing." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the wind still running hard, though it had dropped in the last day from its peak, and something in the sound of it felt different, not breaking, not yet, but perhaps beginning to consider breaking. "The filing is legitimate," she said. "I know it is. My father was careful." "It is," Drummond agreed. "I had it reviewed. It will stand." "Then there's nothing to deal with," she said. "It's mine. It was always mine." He nodded. He started to rise. "Mayor Drummond," she said. He stopped. "Why did you come?" she said. "Out here. You could have waited in Millhaven. You might have made it." He considered the question with more seriousness than she had expected. She had asked it partly to understand and partly because she was her father's daughter, and her father had always believed you learned more from a person's honest accounting of their own motivations than from anything they did. "Because 17 people were already dead," he said. "And I knew, standing at that window, looking at the snow, that more would die if I stayed. And the only reason any of them were dead, the only reason I had no answer for what was happening, was because I had spent months dismissing every sign that this was coming. including you. He paused. I came because it was the only thing left that might be right. He went back to his place against the west wall. Astrid looked at her calculations for a long moment. Then she added a note at the bottom, a small adjustment to the rationing schedule that would stretch the remaining provisions by 2 more days if needed. She was, as her father had always said, a practical woman. Halvard declined on the 12th day. She saw it before it was visible to anyone else, a return of the shallow breathing, a new stillness in him that was different from the stillness of rest. She moved his water closer, adjusted his blankets, sat with him in the quiet hours while the room slept around them. She did not pretend not to herself. She knew what declining looked like. She had sat with her father in his last hours, and she recognized the quality of this, the particular inward turning of a person who was beginning the last passage. He was lucid. That was the mercy of it. He knew where he was and who was there and what was happening around him, and he found it, she thought, satisfactory. More than satisfactory. She watched him watch the room, the sleeping children, the breathing adults, the small constant flame of the stove, and his face held something she did not have a single word for. Something in the neighborhood of completion. On the 13th night, he called her close. She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hand. His hands were warm, which surprised her. The rest of him was cooling, but his hands were warm, and she held them both and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said between them. I have been thinking, he said, about the winter of '56. I know, she said, the men who died. He was quiet for a moment. I have thought about them every winter since. Wondered if I could have done something different. Gotten them underground somehow. Saved them. He turned his head to look at her. I decided a long time ago that I couldn't have. That I was 22 years old and I didn't have enough knowledge yet, and there wasn't time, and the storm was too fast. He paused. But I also decided that if I ever had the chance to pass on what I learned, I would. I would do it right. I would find someone who could hold it properly. His hand tightened on hers slightly. The strength surprised her. The earth remembers summer, he said, even in the worst of it, even when everything above is death and dark and cold, 55 degrees, all year, the earth keeps it. He looked at the ceiling, the packed sod and cottonwood poles that separated them from the storm. Now these people will remember you, the same way. I learned it from you, she said, and from my father. You learned the technique from me, he said. You learned everything else yourself. He closed his eyes. His breathing was very slow. That's how it works. The knowledge moves through people. Niels to me to your father to you to everyone in this room. A pause. They'll teach their children. Their children will teach theirs. Long after all of us are gone, someone in Dakota will know how to go underground in a storm because of one winter, because of you. His breathing slowed further. Halvard, she said. I'm here, he said. I'm right here. He was quiet for a long time. She held his hands and the stove burned, and the room breathed around them in the dark. Your father, he said, very quietly. Good man, careful man. A long pause. He knew what he had. Then he was still. She sat with him for a while in the quiet. Then she went to wake Drummond because he was the one who would need to help her with what came next, and because waking him was the right thing to do, and she had always tried above everything to do the right thing. Drummond was awake before she reached him. He had heard, in whatever way people hear the significant silences of a room they are sharing, that something had changed. He went and stood by the bed and looked at the old man for a long moment. He reached out and put his hand on Halvard's chest briefly, in the way of someone trying to say something they do not have words for. Then he straightened. His face was doing something she had not seen it do, not collapsing, not performing, just working the internal machinery of a man processing something at more depth than he was accustomed to. When he turned around, his eyes were wet. He made no attempt to conceal it. The storm broke on the 15th day. Not all at once. Nothing that large breaks all at once. It loosened, that was the word for it, like a fist slowly opening. The wind dropping from 50 miles an hour to 30, then 20, then the particular stillness of a post-blizzard landscape that is the most profound silence most people will ever hear. The snow stopped falling, the temperature rose, not to warmth, but to the upper range of cold which felt, after what had come before, like something almost livable. Astrid opened the door of the dugout on the morning of the 15th day, and stepped out into a world that had been remade. The drifts were enormous. 8, 10, 12 feet in places, sculpted by weeks of sustained wind into shapes that looked architectural, deliberate, as though something had designed them. The sky above was a blue she had almost forgotten. Real blue, winter blue, the color of a sky that has been scoured clean by what it has been through. She stood on the shelf outside her entrance for a long moment. The valley below was silent. Millhaven, what she could see of it from the hill, was half buried. Several structures were visibly damaged or gone. The land had been reorganized by the storm, the familiar geography altered, smoothed, and redrifted into something that would take the whole spring to understand. Behind her, she heard the door and turned to find Drummond standing there. He looked at the valley for a long time. "How many do you think?" he said. "In town, 17 that I know of." She paused. "There will be more on the outlying farms. People who couldn't make it to Millhaven before the worst hit." He nodded. His jaw was set against whatever he was feeling. "I need to get back," he said. "Begin the assessment, the relief telegrams. There's a great deal to organize." "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. "I'd like to ask you something." She waited. "When the relief parties come," he said, "there will be journalists, people from the Eastern papers who want to write about what happened here, about the storm and what it did." He paused. "I intend to tell them the true account, all of it, including what I did and didn't do, including what you built and how you built it and why you were building it in the first place." He met her eyes. "You have the right to tell that story yourself, and I will say so publicly. But I wanted you to know what I intend to say." She considered him for a moment. "Tell it accurately," she said. "That's all I ask." He nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more. She could see it, the thing working in him that was not yet language, but he didn't, and she respected him for knowing the difference between what needs to be said and what needs to be sat with until it becomes something else. He went back inside. The relief wagons came from Sioux Falls on the 22nd of March. She saw them from the hill in the early afternoon, a column of movement on the southern road dark against the brilliant white of the post-storm landscape, moving carefully over the packed drifts that had reorganized the road into something only approximately passable. They brought food, medical supplies, blankets, and 4 journalists from Chicago and 1 from New York who had heard through the telegraph dispatches Drummond had managed to send after the storm broke the outline of what had happened. Drummond stood at the front of the gathered survivors when the wagons arrived and said what he had told Astrid he would say. He said it plainly without deflection, in the flat, honest tone of a man making a public accounting that he knows is insufficient but is the most he has to offer. 17 people died in this storm in the town of Millhaven, he said. More died on the surrounding farms. 23 people survived because a 17-year-old girl built a shelter into a hillside that I spent 3 months trying to find and shut down. I called her an animal. I called her a vagrant. I said no decent person hides the way she was hiding. He stopped, looked at his hands. I was wrong about everything. Wrong about what survival looks like. Wrong about what preparation means. Wrong about who in this county deserved the benefit of the doubt. He looked at Astrid, who was standing to his right with the careful stillness she brought to everything. I owe this young woman my life, he said. I owe her an apology I cannot make adequately and will spend a long time trying to make anyway. The journalist wrote quickly. Astrid spoke when they asked her to. She said what was true and left out what was not essential, which was how her father had taught her to tell things. I didn't build this to prove anyone wrong, she said. I built it because I had nowhere else to go, and my father had left me the land and the knowledge to do something with it. I learned from him and from Halvard Bjorn how to work with the earth instead of against it. She looked out at the surviving people of Millhaven gathered in the late March sunlight, faces she had known her whole life looking back at her. You can laugh at someone's preparations. You can call them crazy, call them whatever makes you feel superior. But when the storm comes, and the storm always comes, the ones who prepared are the ones who survive. And if they're good people, they'll save you too. One of the journalists asked her what she would do next. Build, she said, properly this time, on the surface. Add to what's already there. She looked at the hill behind her. This is my land. It was always my land. I intend to stay on it. The legal matter of the 30 acres resolved itself in April at a hearing in Sioux Falls before a circuit judge who reviewed Erling Voss's filing and found it sound in every particular. Helga did not contest it. She had signed a statement in March before the relief wagons arrived renouncing any claim to the South Hillside and acknowledging that the filing had been valid from the beginning. She came to Astrid before she left Millhaven in the first week of April, when the snow was retreating and the mud beneath it was cold and rich and beginning to show the first pale promises of spring. She came without announcement on foot to the hill. Astrid saw her coming and went out to meet her. They stood in the thin spring sunlight on the slope outside the dugout entrance and looked at each other. "I'm going back to Minnesota," Helga said. "I have a sister in St. Paul. I should have gone there after my first husband died instead of—" She stopped, started again. "Instead of looking for arrangements." Astrid said nothing. "Your father," Helga said, "was a better man than I knew how to recognize at the time." She looked at the valley below at the damaged town beginning its slow reconstruction. "I'm sorry I didn't know it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't know a lot of things sooner." "All right," Astrid said. Helga looked at her. "That's all you're going to say." "What would you like me to say?" A long pause. "I suppose I'd like you to say, you forgive me." Astrid thought about it honestly the way she thought about everything. She thought about September, about the kitchen table, and the document with his 14-month-old signature. She thought about the third night in the dugout, the hand on the shoulder, the thing that had shifted without resolving. "I don't know yet," she said. "I think it takes time. Real things take time." She paused. "But I don't wish you harm. I want you to have a good life in St. Paul. I want whatever's next for you to be better than what came before. I think that's real, and I can say that honestly." Helga absorbed this, nodded once slowly with the expression of a woman receiving what is actually on offer rather than what she had hoped for, and finding that what is on offer is under the circumstances more than she deserves. "Thank you," she said, "for the dugout, for the warmth." "Go safely," Astrid said. She watched Helga walk down the hill and across the valley floor and into the town that was already board by board and beam by beam beginning to put itself back together. She buried Halvard on the hillside in May, when the ground was soft enough to work and the grass had come back in the particular fierce green of a Dakota spring that follows a hard winter. Drummond came and the blacksmith Gruber and Mrs. Larkin, the school teacher, and most of the 23 and a handful of others from Millhaven who had not been in the dugout but understood by now what Halvard Bjorn had made possible. She had cut the stone herself. It took her 3 weeks working in the evenings after the day's construction was done, chiseling the words into a piece of pink granite she had found in the glacial till on the north side of the hill. She had thought about what to put on it for a long time, and what she came back to every time was what Halvard himself had said about the winter of 1856 and what he had done with what he survived. Halvard Bjorn, 1816-1887. He taught us how to disappear. We learned how to survive. She stood at the grave after the others had gone in the late afternoon sunlight that was long and golden, the way Maylight is in Dakota, and she thought about him and about her father and about the chain of knowledge that ran from the Lakota through Halvard and through Erling and through herself and out into the 23 people who had been warm in the ground all winter and who were now, every one of them, alive and building and carrying something they had not carried before. That was how it worked. She understood that now, in a way, she had not entirely understood before. Not ideas, not principles, not the words people put on paper or said at ceremonies. The knowledge that mattered moved through hands, through work, through the specific and unglamorous transmission of one person showing another person exactly how to do the thing that needs to be done, and the second person doing it and remembering. She stood at the grave until the light went amber and then pink and then the particular deep blue of a Dakota evening when the sky is clear and enormous and the stars are beginning to think about appearing. Then she walked back down the hill to her home. Leif Strand had come with the second relief wagon in early April, a Norwegian carpenter from Fargo who had heard through the relief organizations that there was significant reconstruction needed in Millhaven County and who had come west with his tools and no particular plan beyond being useful. He had dark hair and quiet hands and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who are genuinely comfortable with silence, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned to be careful about what they say and when. He was 24 years old and had grown up in a village 20 miles from the Telemark region of Norway, where Erling Voss had been born, which meant nothing practically and felt to Astrid like something anyway. He built well. She noticed that first before she noticed anything else about him, the quality of his work, the way he thought ahead, the way he fit things together as though he had already seen in his mind what the finished thing would be and was simply executing the vision rather than discovering it as he went. He stayed through the summer, then through the fall. He did not explain why he stayed, and she did not ask because she was her father's daughter and understood that some things are better understood through their evidence than through their explanation. He proposed in November on the anniversary of the day she had started digging, standing on the hillside in the cold with his breath fogging in the air between them, saying what he wanted to say plainly and directly, in the way of a man who has thought about something long enough to be sure of it. She said yes. They built together through the following years the surface homestead, taking shape above the dugout, which became a root cellar, and cold storage, and in the worst winters, an additional room. 4 children came, 3 daughters and a son, all of them raised in the specific way that their mother had been raised, with knowledge in their hands and the land in their understanding, and the deep Dakota sky above them as their first and most permanent classroom. Astrid taught them everything: how to read the weather 3 days ahead, how to preserve food through a hard winter, how to calculate what they needed and prepare for more than they calculated, how to read the signs that animals give when something is coming, how to work with the earth rather than against it because the earth is older than anything built on top of it and keeps its own counsel and rewards those who pay attention. She taught them about Halvard. She told them the story of the winter of 1856, the men who died above ground, and the young man who survived below it, and how he had carried that knowledge for 30 years until the right person needed it. She took them to his grave on the hillside every spring and read them the words on the stone, not because they needed to be read to them, but because saying them aloud in the spring air, with the green coming back in the grass, was a way of keeping something alive that deserved to stay alive. And every morning and every season, the smoke rose from the hillside. In summer, it was barely visible, a heat shimmer above the kitchen chimney gone in the warm air before it reached any height. In autumn, it was thin and blue, catching the slant light of October mornings. In winter, it was what it had always been: gray and steady, and impossibly persistent, rising from the frozen earth like something the ground itself was exhaling. The people of Millhaven learned over the years to look for it, not out of curiosity, not anymore, out of something closer to reassurance. The smoke meant the Voss homestead was warm. Meant Astrid Strand. She went by Strand after her marriage, but everyone called her Astrid Voss. Still, the way towns remember the names of people who saved them was up and working and tending to the things that needed tending. The old-timers, the ones who had been in the dugout, developed a phrase for it. When someone was mocked for being too cautious, for stockpiling more than they needed, for building better than the situation seemed to require, the old-timers would shake their heads and say, "Remember the smoke from nowhere." Remember what it meant before we knew where it was coming from. It meant someone was keeping a fire burning that nobody could see. It meant someone was ready for something that hadn't arrived yet. It meant that the things that look like nothing, the rocky ground, nobody wants the hole in the hillside, nobody finds the girl walking away from town with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her head, are sometimes the things that save everyone. Drummond resigned his position in the spring of 1888 and spent the following years in what could only be called public service of a different kind, not the organizing and pronouncing kind he had practiced as mayor, but the quieter kind, the showing up and asking what is needed and doing it kind. He helped rebuild 12 homes in Millhaven. He funded the new school. He lobbied the county for better road maintenance into the outlying farms. He never ran for office again. He came to the Voss hillside every October until he was too old to make the walk, and helped with the winter preparation, the wood splitting in the root cellar, stocking the annual check of the dugout seal, and the chimney draw. He was not good at these things, not naturally, but he got better every year, and Astrid showed him what she showed everyone who came to learn, without being asked to, patiently, precisely, without condescension. They became in the way of people who have been through something together that nothing else can approximate, something close to friends. He died in the winter of 1901, peacefully in his bed in Millhaven, with the window facing southeast, so he could see if the morning was clear, the faint thread of smoke rising from the Voss hillside. He had asked for the window to face that direction. The people who cared for him in his last years understood why, and said nothing about it because some things are self-explanatory if you know the story, and by then everyone in Millhaven knew the story. The smoke rose every morning, thin and gray and steady and sure rising from the earth, like a reminder that the ground beneath us is warmer than we think, that the people we dismiss are more capable than we know, that the preparations that look like madness are sometimes the only thing standing between a town and its own extinction. It rose in the dark before dawn when no one was watching. It rose in the clear, cold air of winter mornings when the sky was pink and the snow was unbroken, and the world felt briefly like something that had just been made. It rose in the slow light of spring, in the gold of summer, in the blue of autumn, persistent and quiet, and completely certain of itself. The smoke from nowhere, which was never from nowhere at all, which was always from exactly where a 17-year-old girl had decided to make her stand. Not in anger, not in defiance, not to prove a point to anyone, but simply because her father had given her the land and the knowledge and the understanding that the best thing you can do with what you have been given is to use it well and use it fully, and when the storm comes, open the door.